The moment you should have fallen apart. There are moments in life when you should have collapsed, moments where the weight of what you were carrying should have been the thing that finally broke your back. You don't even fully realize it until later, when you're sitting in a moment of quiet, replaying all the chaos in your mind, and suddenly you whisper to yourself, "How am I still here?" That's the moment this story begins. The space between despair and survival that can only be explained by one thing: grace. Not luck, not timing, not willpower. Grace. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot, on bumper stickers and psalms and church bulletins. But when you've lived through something that should have taken you out, grace becomes more than a word. It becomes breath. It becomes anchor. It becomes that inexplicable peace that settles over you in a room full of panic. It becomes the hand that steadies you when your legs are shaking beneath the weight of your pain. I've walked through a fire I thought would consume me. The kind that doesn't just burn, it changes your name. It tries to make you believe that you are your loss, your mistake, your failure, your heartbreak. I remember the exact moment the storm hit its peak. It wasn't dramatic. No thunderclap, no lightning bolt. Just a Tuesday. Just a text that said it was over. Just an email that said I wasn't needed. Just a quiet moment in the car when I realized I hadn't smiled in months. That's the thing about pain. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, one disappointment at a time, until you're sitting in a room full of people and still feel utterly invisible. You laugh at the right moments. You nod when someone shares a story. But inside, you're screaming for someone to notice that you're unraveling. I unraveled quietly. I performed strength while privately collapsing. I said, "I'm fine," so many times that I almost believed it. But then came the day I couldn't pretend anymore. I found myself in the grocery store parking lot, holding the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I couldn't cry, I couldn't speak, I could barely breathe. I didn't know what to pray. I just said, "God," and even that felt like too much. And yet, even then, grace met me there. Not in a booming voice or a supernatural moment of revelation. No, grace came in whispers, in a song on the radio that sang words my heart couldn't form, in a stranger's kindness that felt too timely to be coincidence, in the quiet realization that I hadn't been forsaken, even though I felt forgotten. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me then. Grace is not always obvious. It's not always loud. It doesn't always come with angelic choirs or parted seas. Sometimes grace looks like making it through the day without breaking down. Sometimes it's waking up the next morning when you weren't sure you wanted to. Sometimes grace is simply this: you're still here. I think we underestimate survival. We treat endurance like it's not spiritual enough, like it's second place to miracles. But surviving is a miracle. Getting up again is holy work. And when you don't know how you did it, that's usually the clearest sign that you didn't do it alone. You were carried. There's something sacred about hindsight. When you're in the thick of the pain, grace can feel so absent. But when you look back, you begin to see it, like footprints in the sand behind you, like breadcrumbs that led you through the forest, like a hand that held yours in the dark, even when you couldn't see it. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." That verse used to sound pretty on a greeting card. But when your spirit has actually been crushed, when your heart is broken in a way that leaves you gasping for air, that verse becomes oxygen. It becomes a promise. It becomes the only thing keeping you from giving up. I want to take you into those moments with me. The nights I sat on the floor, arms around my knees, feeling like everything I'd built was crumbling. The days when I walked into work with a fake smile because I didn't want anyone to know I was falling apart. The long, silent mornings when I stared out the window and asked, "Why me, God? Why now? Why like this?" And I want to tell you what happened next. Nothing. No lightning bolt. No instant fix. No miracle turnaround. But grace. Grace that whispered, "You're not alone." Grace that pulled me out of bed. Grace that taught me how to breathe again. Grace that sat beside me in silence when no words would do. Grace that gave me just enough strength to make it through that hour, and then the next, and then the day. Grace that reminded me, this is not the end. And that's where this testimony begins, not with triumph, but with survival. Not with victory songs, but with quiet resolve. Not with clarity, but with desperation that somehow became prayer. If you're reading this and thinking, that sounds like me, I want you to know something. You're not weak. You're not behind. You're not less than. You're in the middle of grace. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to earn it. You just have to let it hold you. And when people ask you later, how did you make it through? You'll be able to smile, not because you have a perfect answer, but because you've tasted grace. You'll say, I don't know, I just didn't give up. And that will be enough, because grace was never about deserving, it was always about receiving. So here you are, still standing, still breathing, still hoping, maybe not loudly, maybe not confidently, but truly, and that is testimony enough. In the next part, we'll walk further into what it looks like to live with unexplainable grace as your daily companion. But for now, pause, breathe, let this settle. You made it here. You are not alone. You are carried by grace. And that is more than enough to begin again. The weight you didn't know you were carrying. There are burdens we carry that never get names. They build up slowly, layer by layer, like dust gathering in places we never clean until suddenly we realize the air has grown too thick to breathe. You don't even know how heavy it all is until someone tries to hug you and you wince from the ache. Until someone says, "How are you?" And your eyes fill with tears you didn't even know were sitting just behind your smile. That's what grief does. That's what disappointment, betrayal, and failure do. They become invisible backpacks strapped to our souls, filled with memories we don't talk about, fears we've normalized, and lies we've mistakenly believed. I didn't know how much I was carrying until one day my friend said, "You look tired in your spirit." Not my face, not my body, my spirit. And that broke something in me, because it was true. I was exhausted in places that coffee couldn't reach, smiles couldn't fake, sleep couldn't fix. We walk through life with these internal weights, the silent expectations to be okay, the pressure to perform, the fear of being too much and yet never enough. And we become experts at hiding. We know how to show up with our makeup done, our clothes ironed, and our voices steady while inside we're crumbling. And for some reason, we think that makes us strong. But strength is not silent suffering. Strength is the courage to say, I need help. Strength is admitting, I'm not okay. And that has to be okay for now. Grace steps in not just to comfort, but to lift. To carry what you were never meant to shoulder alone. I remember one morning I woke up and the sunlight was filtering through my blinds in that soft golden way that should feel holy. But all I felt was dread. I didn't want to face the day. I didn't want to face myself. I laid there asking God, is this really my life now? Is this the best it gets? And in that moment of honesty, I felt the faintest nudge. Not a loud answer, just a whisper in my soul. This is not the end. That whisper didn't solve my problems. It didn't erase my debt, fix my relationship, or remove my anxiety. But it gave me something stronger than answers. It gave me hope. It reminded me that what I carry does not define who I am. Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And rest is what grace looks like when it puts on skin and enters your everyday life. Not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of knowing you're not alone. The rest of knowing you can collapse in God's arms and not be turned away. The rest of knowing that even if no one else sees the weight you're carrying, He does. Sometimes grace shows up through people. A text that arrives right when you're spiraling. A friend who senses something's off and sits with you without needing an explanation. A worship song that breaks your heart open and washes it clean, all in the same moment. Those are not coincidences. Those are grace. And they are signs you are being carried. And sometimes grace shows up in you. The moment you choose to get up anyway. The decision to try again when everything in you says to quit. The tears you let fall because you finally realize you don't have to be strong for everyone all the time. That's grace rising from within, reminding you that the pressure to be perfect was never from God. There was a season I wore my strength like armor, believing that if I could just power through, I'd earn rest. But grace doesn't work like that. Grace says, rest now. You don't have to earn it. You are loved in your weakness. I began to realize how much of what I carried wasn't even mine to hold. Other people's expectations, false responsibilities, shame over things God had already forgiven, guilt over things I couldn't control. And slowly, I began laying them down. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And each time I did, I felt lighter. Not because life got easier, but because grace got heavier in the places where pain had lived. Letting go isn't easy. Sometimes we've carried things so long they feel like part of us. But God is gentle. He doesn't rip burdens from our hands. He invites us to hand them over. He waits until we're ready. And even when we're not, He walks with us under the weight, sharing the load until we trust Him enough to surrender. One of the greatest acts of faith is not pushing through the pain, but pausing to feel it, naming it, acknowledging its presence, and then inviting God into it. Because grace doesn't ignore wounds, it heals them. There were nights I journaled prayers I couldn't say out loud, pages full of questions and frustration. But grace was in the writing, in the unfiltered honesty, in the willingness to show up, raw and unraveled. God met me there, not with condemnation, but with compassion, not with judgment, but with presence. And that's when I started to see the shift. Not in my circumstances, but in me. The burdens didn't all disappear, but they no longer defined me. The weight was still there, but it was shared. And grace carried the part I couldn't. Friend, maybe today you don't need a solution. Maybe you just need someone to say, I see you, I get it, and you're not alone. Let that be this moment. Let this be the place where you stop striving and start receiving. Let this be the day you allow grace to meet you where you are, not where you think you should be. You are not too broken, you are not too far gone, you are not too much, you are seen, you are known, you are loved, and you are being carried even now. So breathe deep. Let go of the lie that says you have to do it all. Let go of the guilt that keeps whispering you're not enough. Let go of the shame that tries to silence your story. Grace is here, and it's more than enough. The turning point you never saw coming. There comes a point in every story where the character has to decide, will they stay where they are, or will they take the terrifying step forward into the unknown? For many of us, that decision doesn't come with fireworks or a trumpet blast. It comes in the stillness of an ordinary moment, a whisper, a nudge, a quiet invitation from grace itself asking, will you trust me now? For me, it didn't look like courage. It looked like desperation. I had reached the end of myself. The version of me that tried to control everything, manage everyone's expectations, and outrun the silence had finally run out of options. That's the thing about grace. It waits patiently at the edge of your strength. It doesn't barge in. It doesn't shame you for not getting there sooner. It simply sits and waits until you're ready to fall into its arms. I remember sitting on my living room floor, the lights dim, my phone face down, and my Bible open but unread. I was too tired to pretend, too worn to perform. And that's when I heard it, not audibly, but unmistakably. A question in my heart that I couldn't shake. What if this is where your life really begins? It didn't make sense. Everything around me felt like an ending. Dreams had collapsed, relationships had broken, confidence had cracked, but grace was whispering that maybe this was the soil where something new could grow. Maybe brokenness wasn't a period, it was a comma. That was the turning point. Not because circumstances changed, but because I did. I stopped striving. I stopped trying to earn love I already had. I stopped praying for escape and started praying for endurance. I asked God to give me eyes to see Him in the pain, not just after it passed. And that changed everything. Suddenly, ordinary things became sacred. A cup of coffee on the porch felt like communion. A kind word from a friend felt like prophecy. A deep breath felt like praise. Grace didn't remove the pain, but it redefined the moment. It taught me that redemption isn't reserved for the other side of the storm. Sometimes it happens in the middle of it. Psalm 23 says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." That means blessing doesn't always wait for peace. Sometimes God sets the table right in the chaos to show you that your identity is not tied to the noise around you. He invites you to sit, to eat, to be nourished. Not because the battle is over, but because you're His, even while it rages. That was the turning point for me. Not a dramatic miracle, but a holy shift, a change in posture. I went from clenched fists to open hands, from begging to receiving, from hiding to being seen. And it wasn't linear. I still had days when fear screamed louder than faith, still had moments when doubt felt more real than hope. But even then, grace didn't leave. It stayed. It held space for my questions. It didn't demand perfection. It offered presence. I began to write again, not for anyone else, but for me. Journals filled with prayers and poems and pieces of my heart I hadn't looked at in years. And as I wrote, I realized something. The testimony was being formed right in the middle of the mess. Not after I got it together. Not once I had the answers, but right there, in the tears, the confusion, the raw honesty. Sometimes we wait to share our stories until they're tidy, until we have the happily ever after. But what if the world needs your middle? What if someone is drowning in the same ocean you've learned how to float in? What if your almost didn't make it could be the reason someone else doesn't give up? That's the power of grace. It takes our ashes and makes them art. It takes our scars and makes them stories. It takes the chapter we thought we'd never survive and makes it the prologue to someone else's hope. I began to see the divine in the daily, the supernatural in the simple. Grace taught me that I didn't need a platform to be purposeful. I just needed to be present, to show up, to choose love, even when I felt unloved, to offer kindness, even when I felt unseen, to keep going, even when I didn't feel strong, because grace isn't a feeling, it's a force. It pulls you forward when your feet are too tired. It lifts your chin when shame tries to bury you. It reminds you of who you are when life tries to rewrite your name. You are not your worst day. You are not your biggest failure. You are not what they said about you. You are loved. You are chosen. You are carried. And that truth changes everything. If you're at your turning point, let this be your confirmation. You're not crazy for believing there's more. You're not wrong for hoping again. You're not weak for needing grace. You're human, and God delights in meeting us exactly there. So let go of the timeline, release the pressure, take the next right step. And if you don't know what that is, just breathe. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is inhale grace and exhale the lie that says you have to have it all together. You don't. You just have to be held. And grace is holding you still. In part 4, we'll explore what it looks like when grace doesn't just carry you, but begins to rebuild what was lost. When broken pieces start to become something beautiful, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. But for now, rest here. You're not behind, you're not alone. You're exactly where grace can reach you. When grace rebuilds what was lost, it's one thing to be carried through the storm. It's another to open your eyes afterward and see the wreckage, the emotional rubble, the spiritual exhaustion, the relationships strained or severed, the parts of yourself you thought were gone for good. And yet, grace doesn't just bring us through. It rebuilds, not back to what was, but forward into what could be. And the way it begins isn't loud. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, like seeds buried beneath the dirt, working silently, slowly pushing through the soil. After my own turning point, when grace caught me in the free fall and whispered that I was still loved, I thought maybe the hardest part was over. But I quickly realized that healing isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of God in the midst of it. Healing didn't come to me as a one-time miracle. It came one moment at a time, one surrendered thought, one honest prayer, one act of courage. The rebuilding began in my heart before it ever showed up in my circumstances. Grace started reshaping how I saw myself, not as a failure or a burden, but as a beloved child. It was disorienting, honestly. When you've lived so long under the shadow of shame, the light of love feels foreign. You flinch, expecting rejection. You brace yourself for disappointment. But grace kept showing up, again and again, whispering, "You're still mine. I'm not going anywhere." At first, I didn't believe it. I thought maybe it was a phase. Maybe I'd mess up again and God would walk away. But He didn't. Not when I doubted. Not when I lashed out in fear. Not when I took 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. Grace stayed. And slowly, that faithfulness began to change me. I started daring to believe that healing was possible, not just for others, but for me. Not just emotionally, but spiritually, relationally, even creatively. I remember the first time I laughed again. Not a polite laugh, not a forced chuckle, but a real belly-deep laugh that came from joy, not performance. I remember the first time I prayed and didn't ask for anything, just sat in God's presence and thanked Him for staying. I remember the first time I let someone in without fear they'd leave. These were not small victories. These were sacred rebuildings. Grace was reteaching me how to live. I began to find beauty in the broken. I saw how my past wasn't a chain but a chisel. God using even the hardest parts to carve out compassion, empathy, wisdom. I saw how my mistakes didn't disqualify me. They equipped me. They gave me language to speak to others in pain. They gave me insight I couldn't have gotten any other way. And isn't that what grace does best? It turns wounds into wisdom. Not because the pain is good, but because God is. One morning I opened my Bible to Isaiah 61, and the words hit me like a wave, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. That's what grace was doing, slowly, patiently, lavishly, turning my ashes into beauty, not just externally, but deep in my identity. I started writing again, not just to process my pain, but to share my hope. I began volunteering, nervously at first, sharing pieces of my story with others who were still in the middle of theirs. And something miraculous happened. Every time I spoke from my brokenness, someone else found their voice. Every time I named my fear, someone else felt less alone. Every time I said, "Me too," walls came down. That's when I understood. Grace isn't just for getting through. It's for going back, for reaching down to others still trapped in the same place you once were. It's for building bridges, not just shelters. And the more I gave away what I had received, the more whole I became. Rebuilding didn't mean pretending the storm never happened. It meant allowing the storm to teach me how to dance in the rain. It meant standing on ground that once felt like quicksand and realizing it had become holy. Not because I was strong, but because God was faithful. Of course, there were setbacks. Old patterns tried to resurface. Lies whispered again. But this time I had something different. I had history with God. I had proof of His grace, and that evidence became my anchor. When the wind blew, I remembered how far I'd come. When shame knocked, I answered with truth. Grace rebuilt me not into the person I used to be, but into someone new, someone softer, stronger, more aware of others' pain, more anchored in purpose. And it's funny, what I thought disqualified me actually became the foundation of my ministry. My testimony wasn't polished, but it was real. And that realness made room for others. God is not looking for perfect stories. He's looking for honest ones. He's looking for hearts willing to say, "I was lost, and grace found me. I was broken, and grace rebuilt me. I was ashamed, and grace called me chosen." This is what happens when grace carries you long enough. You stop trying to prove your worth and start living from your identity. You stop running and start resting. You stop hiding and start helping. And the rebuilding continues, not as a project to finish, but as a life to live. A daily surrender, a daily yes to the one who never said no to you. So if you're standing in the rubble wondering what could possibly come next, let me say this: grace is already at work. You may not see it yet, you may not feel it, but one day you'll look back and realize this was the moment it all started. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with answers, but with presence. Not with fixing, but with healing. You are not forgotten. You are not forsaken. You are not too far gone. You are being rebuilt by grace, and the masterpiece is already forming. Part 5 will explore what it looks like to walk forward with that new identity, to live out your testimony, not just with words, but with every step you take. But right now, take a moment to honor the work already happening. You're not who you were, and that's the miracle of grace. Living in the light of grace. When grace has carried you through the fire, when it has rebuilt what once was lost, when it has whispered to your weary soul, "You're still mine." You don't walk the same, you don't live the same, and you don't look at others the same. Because grace doesn't just change your past, it changes your posture toward the future. It rewrites how you walk forward. It reframes how you show up for others, and it reshapes what you believe is possible. There's something holy about standing in the aftermath and realizing you're still here. Not by strength, not by strategy, but by grace. Pure, stubborn, unstoppable grace. It humbles you. It makes you less impressed with polished success stories and more moved by scars that speak. It awakens a compassion that's not performative but deeply rooted in lived experience. And it stirs a hunger, not just to be healed, but to help heal. Not just to receive grace, but to reflect it. Living in the light of grace means waking up each day aware that you shouldn't have made it, but you did. That you were counted out, but God counted you in. That the very chapters you wanted to rip out of your story are now the pages someone else desperately needs to read. Grace doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. It doesn't ignore your pain, it gives it purpose. I began to notice that grace was no longer just something I talked about. It was something I carried. In the way I listened, in the way I forgave, in the way I extended kindness when I used to shut down. Grace had become my language, not because I mastered it, but because I couldn't deny what it had done in me. There were moments when I'd see someone in the thick of their struggle and feel that familiar tug. Share your story. And I'd wrestle with it. What if they think I'm too messy? What if they don't believe me? But grace reminded me that it's not about being impressive, it's about being real. And so I began to speak, sometimes in small circles, sometimes through writing, sometimes with one hurting friend over coffee. But every time something sacred happened, eyes softened, tears fell, hope returned. Grace has a way of breaking through defenses, of saying, "Me too," without shame, of sitting in the ashes without rushing the fix. It doesn't preach from a distance. It kneels, it listens, stays. Living in the light of grace also means learning to rest, not in idleness, but in identity. You stop striving to earn what you already have. You stop performing for love and start operating from it. You realize that productivity isn't your worth, perfection isn't your goal, and peace isn't the absence of problems, it's the presence of God. Some days are still hard. Triggers return, old fears knock, but you've changed. Not because the storms are gone, but because now you know where to run. You've seen the faithfulness of God in the wilderness. You've tasted His goodness in the dry land. And you know deep in your bones that grace isn't just a one-time rescue. It's a lifetime companion. I think back to the moments I thought were the end. Those nights when I cried myself to sleep. Those days I couldn't see a future. Those seasons where silence felt like abandonment. And now I see them differently. I see them as sacred spaces where grace met me raw and honest. Where God didn't yell over my pain, He whispered through it. Where He didn't shame my questions, He held them. And where He didn't demand perfection, He offered presence. Living in the light of grace also means embracing joy again. Laughing without guilt, dreaming without fear, hoping without cynicism. Grace gives you permission to live fully, even with your limp, especially with your limp. Because the limp is your reminder that you've wrestled and survived, that you've battled and were blessed. I began to walk differently in relationships, not clinging out of fear, but connecting from wholeness, not controlling but trusting, not needing people to fill a void, but inviting them into overflow. Grace reoriented my heart. It taught me how to love without losing myself, how to say no without shame, how to receive without guilt. There's a freedom that comes when you stop hiding, when you stop apologizing for being a work in progress, when you realize that your story is not a liability, it's a light, and that light isn't meant to be tucked away, it's meant to shine. So now when I speak of grace, I don't do it from theory. I do it from experience, from the rubble and the rebuilding, from the prayers that felt unanswered and the peace that came anyway. From the nights I thought I wouldn't make it, and the mornings I woke up still held. Grace carried me, and now, grace leads me. If you're reading this and wondering if your story is too messy, if your past is too heavy, if your brokenness is too deep, I'm here to tell you it's not. Grace is deeper still. And the same God who found me in the middle of my mess is right there with you now. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to fix yourself first. You just have to say yes. Yes to grace. Yes to healing. Yes to hope. Because grace isn't waiting for you at the finish line. It's walking with you every step. It's holding your hand when you stumble. It's lifting your chin when you hang your head. It's reminding you that you're still here, still loved, still chosen. And if there's anything I've learned, it's this. The testimony of grace isn't about how strong I was. It's about how relentless God is, how He never stopped pursuing, never stopped loving, never stopped believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. So I'll keep telling my story, not because it's tidy, not because it's easy, but because it's true. And in a world desperate for authenticity, truth is powerful. Grace carried me. Grace changed me. And now grace compels me to love, to serve, to share. And maybe, just maybe, the same grace that carried me will carry you too. If this journey resonates with you, I invite you to share your own story. Speak it, write it, live it. Because your story might be the spark that lights someone else's darkness. If this video has spoken to you, I encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe to stay connected. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone. There's more grace ahead. You're not finished, you're just beginning. And grace is walking with you all the way home.